time now to bring you a very, very special interview. He's someone who's been the chief economic advisor in India and has now written a special book called An Economist in the Real World, The Art of Policy Making in India. It's such a pleasure to have with us Kaushik Basu, chief economist of the World Bank. Dr. Basu, many, many congratulations on your new book, An Economist in the Real World, The Art of Policy Making in India. And it would be a pleasure to talk to you about the art of policy making here in India, especially ahead of the budget. But let me start by first asking you, what motivated you to write this book?
This book for me came out of my experience in the Indian government. I was a somewhat unusual chief economic advisor to the government of India. I was actually the first CEA who had no experience in government. So I came from outside with a lot of research, of course, in economics, but that's all I had for me. So it was a very unusual experience where I was learning the ropes of policy making, but I think I was also bringing a fresh perspective to government, because unlike bureaucrats who have had their careers in government, I was bringing an outside point of view. It was out of this interaction that I decided that it's novel enough that I ought to record some of my experience. Also, India has been poised for great performance. It has been that way for some years, and it has actually also grown very well. And I thought this is a timely book to take stock of my experience and also give a little bit of advice to India, that these are the few things that you need to do in order to do even better than you have done. So that is really, in a nutshell, what my book is about.
So let's really talk about the things that India needs to fix. Perhaps if you could have a message there for the Modi government, maybe top 3 things that they really need to fix almost immediately.
Yeah. Where India needs to concentrate on is, let me back up and begin with the following. That as per our forecast, I now sit at the World Bank and do this globally, the forecast for India is the highest among major economies in the world, which has never happened before. So for in the year 2016, we expect India to grow by 7.8%. But there are downside risks, and also there are long-run compulsions. Keeping that in mind, that India is still an emerging economy, it is a developing country, and there is a long distance to go. It's not just 1 year's growth or 2 years' growth. This has to be kept up, this has to be sustained, this has to be inclusive. With that in mind, here are a couple of things which I would stress to this government. That you do want to undertake important structural reforms so that you get the space, you use your budget in order to deliver on certain long-run things. And among them would be, first and foremost, investment in health and education. This does not give you returns within 6 months, but this is something on which the long run of the country depends hugely. And India still has a lot of malnutrition, lot of illiteracy. Invest in health, invest in education, and you are building the long run foundations of the country. Number 2, spend effort on infrastructure. India still needs a lot of infrastructure and better infrastructure in order to make space for the private enterprise, for people wanting to do things, to develop, to grow, to have space to do that. And the third one is cutting down bureaucratic costs. It should be easy for people to start up an enterprise, to close down an enterprise should the need arise, and also to have contracts enforced, to get their electricity connections quick, things like that. So you have to work on these fronts. So these are the 3 things. But let me also, Shweta, take advantage of your question and stress. There are a couple of sectors where India has to do very little in order to really capitalize and do well. Higher education is one of them. And I devote a lot of space in the book to say that India can become a hub for global education, where people will come not just from other developing countries, but even from rich countries to get education here. This will allow the government to spend money on its poorer people, on the population that needs support. And once India also becomes a global hub for education, It's like exporting something. You earn foreign exchange, which you are using, and it also builds soft power because India is going to relate to other countries in the world by bringing students in here. This is something entirely doable for India. You can begin to see action within 1 or 2 years if you take a couple of important moves.
Important message there from you, Dr. Basu, for the government. And let me now get a little more specific, because all eyes are clearly on the union budget. Less than 2 weeks to go for Finance Minister Arun Jaitley to present the budget, which many are calling a truly a make or break budget for the Indian economy. What, according to you, can Arun Jaitley do in this budget to make sure that it ends up being a game changer?
I have to begin by saying that I don't follow the nitty-gritties of the budget the way I used to do 3 years ago, where I knew every number that is going into the budget. And now, because I watch a variety of countries, about 100 countries across the world, so my information is not quite as detailed. However, the important thing to keep in mind in a budget like this, if I may give a general piece of advice, is that the budget is an instrument for all those things that I was just now talking about. So yes, you do want to be fiscally responsible. You want the budget deficit to be small and tidy. However, that cannot be an obsession. The global situation now is very, very difficult. While we are putting India's growth forecast at 7.8%, if you look at the global landscape, there are dangers all around. Latin America is doing poorly. Brazil's growth is negative. Japan, we've just got information, has once again gone into negative growth. And Russia is in negative growth massively. So in this difficult terrain, you may need to give a little bit of extra fiscal stimulus to get India going. So while fiscal discipline is important, we must not make an obsession of that.
Dr. Basu, it's important you're talking about a fiscal stimulus, almost making a case for giving a fiscal stimulus, because this is coming at a time when your successor as the chief economic advisor, who is now India's central bank governor, Raghuram Rajan, has actually, in a way, sent out a warning against any fiscal stimulus to spur growth. He actually has said that any spending spree to spur economic growth can be counterproductive, time and again citing the example of Brazil, another emerging economy which he believes is in trouble for exactly the same reasons. Do you disagree then with the view of Dr. Rajan that a spending spree will hurt the economy?
No, actually, I don't disagree at all. A spending spree is usually a bad idea, and giving government the space to do that, it's very easy to have the spree in domains which are not critical to growth. What I'm stressing is something very similar. The fiscal discipline, as I said, is extremely important. You want to keep that in mind. At the same time, when the global situation turns as difficult as it has done right now, you don't want that to be an obsession. But when you are deciding that, okay, I'm going to relax this a little bit given the special situation today, everything depends on where is it that you are taking liberties. And so here again, you have to keep in mind, you do not want to just give out handouts to become more popular, but you have to give out the right space to investment so that infrastructural investment empowers business and enterprise, and health and education so ordinary people are more productive and can do more. So the fiscal stimulus that can be given has to be given in a very measured way, keeping in mind that you do want to keep even the medium-term, long-term fiscal discipline very much in sight.
Dr. Basu, the other debate that's taking place ahead of the budget is whether the government at this stage, when private investment is at a standstill, needs to incentivize private sector, incentivize corporate India by way of tax breaks or tax incentives to go ahead and invest. The other debate, of course, is that many are saying it's time now to actually end and do away with these corporate subsidies, something that even Prime Minister Modi has talked about. Which side of the debate are you on? What would be your advice at this stage?
Shweta, if I knew the numbers better, I would be able to talk directly to this question. But what I can point out in general, the good rule about all taxation is to have it as uniform as possible, not have special breaks, and then work with that so that everyone is playing on a level playing field. But that is a general advice that I would give on this.
all right, have a level playing field, in some ways suggesting there that you need to end some of those tax subsidies or tax breaks that one has been giving. But what will be the impact there is something that obviously the finance minister will need to assess. Dr. Basu, let's try and move across now to talk about what's happening globally and its impact on India. And the one trend that India has really benefited from is collapsing commodity prices. Of course, we've seen some attempts now to freeze output of crude oil prices. But if I could get your overall sense on the kind of windfall gains that India has seen because of oil prices collapsing from the highs of $140 a barrel to now less than $30 a barrel. Do you think India has done enough to take advantage of this situation of extremely low oil prices?
The falling commodity prices for the entire South Asia region is a benefit, because this entire region is probably the only region of this size that consists of all importers, and India is one of them. This is a great opportunity, and according to our calculation, oil prices will remain low for some more time. It will probably rise a little bit during the course of this year, but we are expecting it to remain at $37 on average through the year, which is a huge benefit and advantage to India compared to what it was, 130, 140 till fairly recently. India has to work very hard to make sure that this windfall gain that the country is getting through low oil prices is not treated as a bonanza for consumption and immediate betterment, but treated as an opportunity to buy the right kinds of goods that India wants to buy internationally.
All right, Dr. Basu, I also want to get your view overall on the kind of recovery that we're seeing. In many ways, the world has still not recovered from the 2008 crisis. Some, in fact, are even putting out red flags to say we're going to see another dip, another 2008-like scenario before we see recovery truly setting in. What's your view? Are those red flags something that we need to worry about? How bad is the situation as far as the overall global economy is concerned, and when will we see recovery truly setting in?
Sure, very happily. Shweta, what the world is seeing is a very unusual kind of slowdown or stagnation, whatever you want to call it. It's not the deepest stagnation. We've seen very deep stagnations in the past, but it's one of the longest periods of recession or stagnation. It started in 2008, and every time it is going to pick up a little bit, it seems to go down again, and this is now 2016. So we've had virtually 8 years of a global slowdown. With that general slowdown, there are a couple of danger points in the world which could precipitate another crisis, and there is indeed that risk of that. Latin America, Brazil in negative growth. Russia in the year 2015 shrank by close to 4%. We've just got information that Japan in the last quarter again shrank. Europe is growing, but growing very, very slowly. United States and India, in fact, one industrialized country and one developing country, these are the two really bright spots growing very well. But because of the global situation, there are indeed risks. Our overall expectation from our analysis in the World Bank is that we have reached a down point. From here, there is going to be a slow pickup. And one of the reasons why I do expect my point forecast to be a slow pickup in the global economy is when commodity prices fall, like the oil price decline, in the long run, it is beneficial for the world, critical goods being sold cheaper. But during the period of a decline, it tends to have a negative effect because the whole world is adjusting to the decline. As we get used to lower prices of commodities and of oil, it is only expected that the benefits will kick in across the world. So our expectation is that we have reached a difficult point, but from here onwards, there is going to be a slow pickup. But that is the point forecast. There are some probability risks that there is going to be a downturn, and we have to just sit with our seatbelts fastened just in case there is a major slowdown.
All right, so you're saying that this is a recovery which will be a slow one. It will take time before we see the global economy finally recovering. Dr. Basu, you've time and again talked about India being the bright spot and India being one country that's really standing out in an otherwise slowdown that overall that we're seeing across the globe. But there's a lot of debate that's going on in India about the GDP numbers. The World Bank forecast is also painting a very, very pretty picture as far as India's GDP growth is concerned. But economists economists as well as experts here are worried about those numbers being far removed from reality. Many have even questioned the validity of those numbers. What's your view really on the new GDP series and the kind of criticism it has managed to attract of not being in sync with ground reality?
No, I don't agree with that. Actually, India's GDP numbers, and I used to be once very involved in the process of collection, it's a very transparent, open process with lots of people collecting it. So rigging India's GDP numbers is very, very difficult, mercifully so, and India has not been in that game. Having said that, GDP is collecting the entire country's goods and services into one number. In that, there are some conceptually open questions. So no one deliberately rigs it, but there are some conceptually open questions. So indeed, there will be periods of reforming, trying to do this better. But overall, I think India's GDP figures are very, very reliable. So the figure that we are seeing, India's growth at 7.3% or so, as has happened up to now, is something quite reliable. What I think people are sensing, and this is giving a little bit of a negative feedback, is there are fluctuations. The stock markets, there are certain indicators, the exchange rate is making people a bit nervous. And the nervousness, there is good reason. The world situation is very difficult. Things can go wrong. So you have to sit all prepared. But the GDP numbers, as we have on India, are fairly reliable. And you can safely work with those numbers as the numbers, best numbers that describe India.
All right, the best numbers that describe India, and if the World Bank chief economist is saying India's GDP numbers are reliable, that certainly carries a lot of weight. Dr. Basu, thanks for that. But let me focus now, especially on India's rural sector that's seeing tremendous distress. When we look at the overall picture of India's growth, the number, once again, as we said, looks good, looks impressive, especially if you compare it with the rest of the world. But see the situation in India's villages, farmers committing suicide, the suicide belts across states, irrespective of which political party seems to be in power in those states. And that clearly tells us that agriculture in India today is seeing the worst growth phase since the 1991 reforms. Now, do you think the government's not doing enough and not paying enough attention to the rural economy, to the agriculture sector?
The agriculture sector for India has become a relatively small sector, but it's a critically important sector. So there is no taking away from the fact that you need to pay a lot of attention to agriculture. You need to do everything possible to have agriculture grow and do well. Having said that, one area where India has not taken the advantage that is there for India to pick up is the manufacturing sector. India has done historically extremely well in services, and we ought to continue to stress that. But the manufacturing space is a space that India has not taken advantage of. And now with Chinese wages rising and a huge space globally being vacated by China leaving that space, India also ought to stress a lot on the manufacturing space, and India is beginning to do that. But you need structural reforms to be able to take advantage of the space that is becoming available.
It's important you're mentioning manufacturing, and especially the India-China comparison always comes in. China clearly a manufacturing powerhouse for the world. India now trying to move in that direction, and the government has taken a number of steps, including the Make in India initiative, which is essentially aimed at creating jobs, making sure that India moves forward rather quickly on the path of turning into a manufacturing powerhouse. Dr. Basu, once again, when it comes to initiatives like Make in India, there has been some concern that while, yes, right now as we speak, there is a big roadshow, a big Make in India week that is taking place in Mumbai, but when it comes to ground realities, what we're seeing happen is what many feel more hype than reality, or more talk than real action on the ground to encourage investors to come and make in India. Your thoughts, sir?
Shweta, with all campaigns, the hype is a part of it. I mean, this any country would do, any organization would do, and you do want to build up the momentum through the campaign. So I would not say that you take away from that noise and hype of the campaign. What is important is the campaign has to be backed up very quickly, so that you build up that enthusiasm, and then you have to come up with reforms, with policies that back that up. And this is a fresh campaign, this is new and yet to be seen. All I can say is that We have to now back it up with actual moves so that things begin to change, so that 6 months down the road, 9 months down the road, when people look back and say that, well, this was a hype, but it was well worth it because India is beginning to move thanks to the hype and thanks to the action on the ground. It is that action on the ground that is needed now.
All right, Dr. Basu, let me focus a little now on your book, in which you've spent a lot of time analyzing India's bureaucracy. Even right now, there's a lot of debate happening on the way forward for India's bureaucracy. You've actually made a case saying that while there are interesting ideas, it is very hard to get India's bureaucratic structure to change or to adopt some of those new ideas. In many ways, they are very set in their thinking. Let's get from you an advice then coming for ways in which India's bureaucracy needs to be re-energized, a sort of makeover for India's bureaucracy.
I have two pieces of advice on this. One is something which has been given several times, and India is beginning to move on that, which is you simply have to work relentlessly to cut down on bureaucratic costs. A modern economy needs regulation. You can't do without regulation. But you want the regulation to be efficiently followed. I mean, in most industrialized countries, whether it be Singapore or United States, you probably have more regulation than India. But the regulation is enforced quickly, and India ought to work very hard on doing that. But there is a second piece of advice on the transactions cost and the bureaucracy, is that you need a fresh infusion of ideas. It's very easy to think that economic policy making is just gut feeling and intuition and you can run a huge country with that. That is not true. So one of the things that India should do, which is done in most industrialized countries, is bring in an infusion of ideas from outside, whether it be economists who are not in government, who come in with fresh ideas, stir up debate, or people in the corporate sector who have had experience over there and are brought in for a couple of years into government. India needs that infusion. It's going to bring ideas to the table. Some will be acceptable, some not. But India is a country which encourages diverse ideas. It encourages debate. And that openness India must retain, and that will give India a lot of power in the long run.
Dr. Basu, let me end today's interaction by getting an overall view from you on the way forward for India and the performance of the Modi government so far, the hits and misses. If you could possibly tell our viewers the one thing that you feel the Modi government has done right, the one thing that it could have done better.
Shweta, if I was sitting here and watching only one country, I would be able to give you a clear answer on this. But as I said, I now watch 100 countries, and it is not with that kind of a detail that I look into this. I feel the stress on manufacturing is an important stress that has been given. And as I just said, you now need to back this up with reforms so that you begin to move on that.
Dr. Kaushik Basu, Chief Economist, World Bank, many thanks for joining us and sharing your perspective on a number of issues. Remember, Kaushik Basu had been the Chief Economic Advisor in the Indian government as well, and his views ahead of the budget are very, very important. But key takeaways, he believes India's GDP numbers are reliable. He believes India is a bright spot, and as far as oil prices are concerned, World Bank Chief Economist saying they will stay in the range of $37 a barrel for this year. Thank you so much, Dr. Basu, for sharing your perspective on a range of issues.
Thank you very much, Shweta.
All right, we're going to slip into a quick break, but we'll be back with the 2:30 factor, getting a sense of where the markets are headed today.